June 11th, 1962, began like any other morning on the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. The guards at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary made their rounds at precisely 7 a.m., moving cell to cell as they had done every morning for years. 3 bunks held what appeared to be sleeping men. The silhouettes were convincing. The hair visible above the blankets looked entirely human. But when one guard reached into the cell and pulled back the covers, he found only a crude papier-mâché head staring blankly upward. The prison that had never recorded a successful escape had just lost 3 men. What followed was one of the most exhaustive manhunts in American federal history, a mystery that consumed investigators for decades, a question that has never been formally answered. Alcatraz Island sits roughly 2.4 kilometers off the coast of San Francisco. The surrounding bay water rarely rises above 12 degrees Celsius. Powerful currents sweep through the channel at speeds that make even experienced swimmers reconsider their judgment. The island was selected as a federal penitentiary in 1934 precisely because its geography was considered inescapable. By 1962, it had housed some of the most dangerous and notorious criminals in the United States, among them Al Capone and Robert Stroud. The facility operated on the principle that the water itself served as the final and most effective barrier to freedom. That assumption was about to be shattered. The 3 men who vanished that night were Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin. Morris had been transferred to Alcatraz in 1960. After a series of escape attempts at other federal facilities. Prison records noted that he possessed an exceptionally high intelligence quotient, placing him in the top percentile of all inmates evaluated during that era. John Anglin, 32 years old at the time, Clarence Anglin, 31, had been convicted of bank robbery and were known for their persistence and physical endurance. A 4th man, Alan West, had been part of the original planning but failed to widen his own cell opening in time and was left behind when the others departed. The escape had not been improvised. Evidence gathered in the days following the disappearance revealed that Morris and the Anglin brothers had been preparing meticulously for more than 6 months. They had obtained discarded saw blades from workshop assignments and used them to carefully chip away at the deteriorating concrete around the ventilation grills at the rear of their cells. The work was done during music hour each evening, when the sound of instruments playing in the recreation hall masked the scraping. They enlarged the openings only enough to squeeze through, the grills in place each night, so that nothing appeared disturbed during routine inspections. Above their cells, a wide utility corridor ran the length of the cell block. This space, largely unused and poorly monitored, became their workshop. Over months of accumulated effort, the men constructed an extraordinary collection of improvised tools and materials in that corridor. They fashioned a set of life preservers and an inflatable raft from more than 50 rubber raincoats that had been stolen from fellow inmates. Stitched together, and sealed with contact cement acquired through various means. The raft, when later tested by investigators using recovered fragments, proved capable of holding a person afloat. The precision of the construction stunned the engineers who examined it. The dummy heads that deceived the morning guard represented perhaps the most chilling element of the preparation. Each head had been sculpted from a mixture of soap, concrete dust, and toilet paper. Real human hair collected from the prison barber shop was embedded into the scalp. Paint mixed to approximate skin tone was applied with brushes fashioned from scraps of material. The finished products were not masterworks of art, but in the dim light of a prison cell they were entirely convincing. The men had studied the exact angle from which the guards looked through the cell bars and positioned each dummy accordingly. On the night of June 11th, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers climbed through their enlarged ventilation openings, moved up through the utility corridor to the roof, descended a drain pipe to the ground, crossed to the northern shore of the island, and inflated their raft. The precise time of their departure from the water's edge has never been established with certainty. Investigators later estimated the departure occurred sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight. The tidal conditions at that hour would have determined almost everything about where the current carried them and how long they could survive on the open water. The following morning, when the alarm was raised, the Coast Guard launched an immediate search of the bay. Within hours, helicopters were circling the waters while patrol boats swept in expanding grids. A paddle crafted from plywood, 2 life preservers made from the same rubber raincoat material used in the raft's construction. A small packet of personal items belonging to Clarence Anglin were recovered floating near Angel Island. The items were wet, consistent with the raft having capsized or deflated. No bodies were found. Not then, and not in the days or weeks that followed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation took charge of the official investigation almost immediately. Agents interviewed Alan West at length, extracting every detail of the escape plan that he could provide. West described the route with precision, confirmed the materials used, acknowledged that the plan had always included crossing to Marin County on the northern shore, where the men intended to steal a car and acquire dry clothing. Whether that final stage was ever reached became the central question. The FBI kept the case formally open for 17 years, until 1979, when it was officially transferred to the United States Marshals Service. That continues to list the 3 men as fugitives to this day. Physical evidence recovered from the utility corridor and the cells gave investigators a detailed picture of the operation's scope. Beyond the dummy heads and the raft materials, agents found homemade tools. A periscope constructed from mirrors and cardboard that had been used to monitor guard movements. A crude but functional drill fashioned from a modified electric fan motor. The level of engineering involved in each improvised device indicated sustained ingenuity and a capacity for long-term strategic thinking. Criminologists who later studied the case noted that the complexity of the preparation exceeded anything documented at Alcatraz before or since. The question of whether the men survived the crossing has produced 2 firmly divided camps over the decades. Those who believe the escape ended in drowning point to the brutal conditions of San Francisco Bay on the night of June 11th. Water temperature at the surface averaged 10 degrees Celsius. Hypothermia in such conditions can incapacitate an adult within 30 minutes. The improvised raft showed signs of having been inflated and used, but there was no evidence it ever reached land intact. The FBI's own early assessment concluded that the probability of survival was extremely low, given the conditions, the equipment, the distance to shore. The opposing view rests on a foundation of evidence that accumulated over the following decades, and that investigators found genuinely difficult to dismiss. In 1975, 13 years after the escape, a man matching Clarence Anglin's description was photographed at a bar in Brazil. The photograph was examined by federal agents who could not definitively confirm or deny the identification. The Anglin family, who maintained consistent contact with law enforcement over the years, repeatedly insisted that John and Clarence were alive and had been in contact with relatives. A Christmas card postmarked from a city in the southern United States arrived at the Anglin family home in 1962, 6 months after the escape. Handwriting analysts studied the card but could not produce a conclusive result. In 2013, more than 50 years after the disappearance, investigators at the United States Marshals Service received what they described as a credible piece of new evidence. A photograph submitted anonymously showed 2 men in Brazil in the mid-1970s. Forensic specialists used facial recognition software calibrated against known photographs of John and Clarence Anglin and produced a result indicating high probability of a match. The men in the photograph appeared older than the Anglins had been in 1962. That was consistent with the timeline. The lead was serious enough to prompt a formal reinvestigation, though no arrest followed. The Anglin family's public statements over the years added a layer of complexity that official investigators found both useful and frustrating. Relatives described receiving letters and phone calls from men claiming to be John and Clarence years after the escape. A nephew gave a detailed interview in 2015, in which he stated that both brothers had attended their mother's funeral in 1973, disguised with makeup and wigs. If accurate, this account placed the men alive and on American soil more than a decade after their disappearance. The FBI reviewed the claim and acknowledged it could not be disproven, though it could not be verified either. Frank Morris presented a separate and in some ways more puzzling thread of the investigation. Fewer reported sightings were attributed to him. No letters, no photographs, no family statements suggested contact. His background offered a partial explanation. Morris had no surviving close relatives who publicly maintained interest in his fate. He had moved through the foster care system as a child and had spent the majority of his adult life in federal custody. If he survived the Bay crossing, he had no network to return to and no one likely to speak on his behalf. His trail, whatever it might have been, went entirely cold. In 2009, a Dutch documentary production team worked with forensic hydrologists to reconstruct the exact tidal and current conditions present on the night of June 11, 1962. The simulation, which used data from historical weather records and advanced fluid dynamics modeling, produced a startling result. If the men had departed the island between 11 p.m. and midnight and paddled northward, the current would have carried them toward the Marin headlands rather than into the open ocean. The simulation suggested that under those specific conditions, survival was not only possible, but plausible. The researchers presented their findings to federal authorities, who incorporated the data into their ongoing assessment. The physical condition of Alcatraz itself contributed to the escape in ways that federal administrators were reluctant to acknowledge publicly. By the early 1960s, the facility was crumbling. Salt air and decades of moisture had penetrated the concrete, the cell walls in a state of advanced deterioration. The blocks that Morris and the Anglins removed crumbled almost silently under the pressure of improvised tools. A prison maintained in better structural condition might have made the initial breach impossible. The Bureau of Prisons had been aware of the facility's deterioration for years. Alcatraz was officially closed on March 21, 1963, less than 9 months after the escape. The combination of mounting maintenance costs and the devastating embarrassment of losing 3 prisoners proving too much to sustain. The investigation also uncovered a troubling procedural failure on the part of the prison's overnight guard rotation. Standard protocol required that guards physically confirm the presence of each inmate by shining a flashlight directly on the individual and visually verifying movement or breathing. Testimony gathered after the escape indicated that several guards on the overnight shift had been conducting what amounted to visual sweeps rather than close inspections. The dummies exploited precisely this gap. Whether this represented a systemic relaxation of protocol or individual negligence on specific nights was never fully determined. No guard faced formal disciplinary action. Letters purportedly from John Anglin surfaced again in 2018, when the San Francisco Police Department released documents showing that a letter had been received by the department in 2013. The letter's author claimed to be John Anglin, stated that all 3 men had survived the crossing, indicated that Frank Morris had died in 2008 at the age of 76. The writer claimed to be in poor health and offered to submit to arrest in exchange for medical treatment and a reduced sentence of no more than 1 year. Forensic linguists who analyzed the letter noted several characteristics consistent with regional dialect patterns from the area of rural Georgia, where the Anglin brothers had grown up. The letter was real. Whether its author was genuine remained impossible to confirm. The case occupied the attention of academic criminologists alongside federal investigators, each approaching the evidence from a different frame. Psychologists who studied the personality profiles of all 3 men noted characteristics that suggested a high capacity for long-term commitment and stress tolerance under extreme circumstances. Morris in particular had demonstrated throughout his criminal history an ability to sustain focus on complex goals over extended periods, without succumbing to impulsivity. Whether such traits translated into survival on open water in the dark was a question no psychological profile could resolve. But the profiles consistently argued against the assumption that the men panicked or abandoned their plan midway through the crossing. The island where they began their journey has since become one of the most visited tourist attractions in the United States. More than 1.4 million people cross to Alcatraz each year. They walk the same cell block corridor, peer into the narrow cells, stand at the ventilation openings through which 3 men disappeared into the night more than 60 years ago. The reconstructed dummy heads are displayed under glass in the prison museum. The life preservers and the paddle fragments are cataloged in federal evidence storage. The raft itself was never recovered in a usable condition. Only the fragments of rubber material that washed ashore in the days after the escape. The United States Marshals Service maintains the case file with a classification that technically still permits prosecution. If John or Clarence Anglin is alive today, each would be well into his 90s. Frank Morris, if the 2013 letter was genuine, is already beyond the reach of any sentence. The marshals have stated publicly that the case remains open as a matter of principle and as a reflection of the service's institutional commitment to closure. Whether that closure will ever come is a question that the bay itself seems disinclined to answer, its cold currents still moving in the same patterns they traced on the night 3 men pushed a rubber raft into the darkness and were never seen again.